Kevin Costner built empires on screen but could not keep a single home intact. The man who protected Whitney Houston in The Bodyguard watched two marriages collapse in courtrooms. The director who made audiences believe in Field of Dreams saw nearly $80 million walk out the door with his first wife, and watched history repeat itself 3 decades later. 7 children, 3 women, 2 devastating divorces, and a fortune spent chasing the one thing fame could never guarantee. At 70 years old, the icon who taught Hollywood how to dream is still searching for something he lost long before the world ever knew his name. But the real tragedy is not the money or the headlines. It is what happened to the boy who never stopped moving and the man who never learned how to stay. His story begins in a rented house in California with a brother he never got to meet. It is heartbreaking to imagine that the man whose quiet strength would one day move millions began. His life surrounded by grief he could not yet name. Kevin Michael Costner was born on January 18, 1955 in Linwood, California. He was the youngest son of William Costner, a ditch digger who would rise to become a power line technician, and Sharon Ray, a social worker whose gentle hands carried the weight of strangers' sorrows every single day. Their home was modest, the furniture worn, the walls thin enough to let winter creep through uninvited. But love lived there, unspoken and steady, holding the family together even when everything else threatened to fall apart. 2 years before Kevin drew his first breath, tragedy had already reshaped the Costner family. His brother Mark Douglas lived for only a single day before his tiny heart stopped beating. It was the kind of quiet loss that changes everything without anyone ever speaking of it aloud. From that moment forward, love in that household became something fierce and guarded. Bill grew stricter, determined to protect his remaining sons from a world he could no longer trust. Sharon grew quieter, folding her grief into long glances and careful gestures. Sometimes Kevin would catch her standing still in the kitchen, eyes fixed on an empty corner as if watching a ghost only she could see. His father would fall silent in those moments, rough hands gripping the table as though he were holding the family together by sheer will. That absence hung in the air like a shadow. And perhaps it was there, in that wordless grief, that Kevin first learned what pain sounds like when it chooses silence instead of tears. By the time he turned 12, he had packed his life into more boxes than most adults ever would. The Costners moved constantly, chasing work that always seemed one town away. Compton, Ventura, Visalia, Orange County. Each relocation brought new schools, new faces, and new goodbyes that arrived before he ever learned how to belong. The sound of packing tape became the soundtrack of his childhood. He was never the loud kid, never the star athlete, never the one teachers remembered at the end of the year. He was the quiet boy at the back of the classroom, who wrote poems instead of answers, and whispered goodbye to towns that never knew he existed. One night, as another moving truck pulled away, Kevin sat in the back seat watching streetlights flicker past like memories he was not allowed to keep. He did not cry. He simply learned to let go before anything had a chance to hold on. But something unshakable took root in that quiet ache. A belief that even if the world refused to see him, he could still build something that would last. By high school, a late growth spurt brought him to 6 feet tall, but the real growth happened within. In church choirs, his voice trembled with longing. At night, he wrote poems about wide-open skies and second chances. He dreamed of places where the ground did not shift beneath his feet, and stories that would never have to be packed into boxes. His father's discipline became his compass. His mother's faith became his foundation. Every goodbye carved strength into him. Every silence taught him to listen deeper. He learned early that life does not owe you comfort. It only offers chances to begin again. That belief carried him into adulthood. At 23, newly married and broke, he did what every good son was expected to do. After graduating from California State University, Fullerton with a degree in marketing, he took a steady job. Each morning he buttoned his shirt, smiled for the world, and felt a small piece of himself disappear behind a desk. The paycheck was reliable, the future predictable, but the silence inside him was deafening. His heart did not live in numbers. It lived in stories. Fate intervened on an ordinary flight home from his honeymoon. Sitting beside him was Richard Burton. Nervously, Kevin confessed that he wanted to act but was terrified to try. Burton studied him for a long moment, then offered simple reassurance. When the plane landed and Burton's limousine pulled away, the legendary actor leaned out the window and wished him good luck. Those 2 words cracked something open that would never close again. Within weeks, Kevin quit his job. Within months, he was scrubbing boats, driving trucks, giving tours of movie stars' homes, and barely making rent. He walked miles to save bus fare, slept in his clothes when the heat failed. and auditioned endlessly only to be rejected again and again. His first role embarrassed him. His part in The Big Chill was cut entirely. He sat at the premiere knowing no one would ever know he had been there. For 6 brutal years, Hollywood treated him as if he did not exist. But the boy who had spent his childhood starting over knew how to survive. In 1985, Lawrence Kasdan offered him a role in Silverado. Something shifted. Audiences noticed. Hollywood noticed. The Untouchables made him a star. Bull Durham made him beloved. Field of Dreams made him immortal. Then came the gamble that defined his career. In 1990, Kevin mortgaged his own money to direct and star in Dances with Wolves, a 3-hour Western spoken partly in Lakota that executives mocked as career suicide. Storms destroyed sets. Budgets spiraled. The press nicknamed it Kevin's Gate. Instead, the film earned $424 million and 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. The boy from Linwood had made history. Success demanded payment. Fame arrived like a flood and drowned the life he had built before the world knew his name. By the early 1990s, he was everywhere. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, earned hundreds of millions. The Bodyguard became a cultural phenomenon. He was one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood, yet the hands that held Oscars could not hold his marriage together. Cindy Silva had believed in him when no one else did. Together, they raised 3 children, Annie, Lily, and Joe, but distance replaced presence. Trust faded quietly. In 1994, after 16 years of marriage, they divorced. With no prenuptial agreement, the settlement reportedly reached $80 million. Kevin later admitted the real cost was watching his children split between 2 homes. The fall came swiftly. Waterworld nearly destroyed him. Hurricanes obliterated sets. Budgets exploded. He nearly drowned during filming. The press mocked him mercilessly. The postman followed and sealed his humiliation. Scripts stopped arriving. The phone went silent. Once again, he was invisible. He rebuilt slowly. A brief relationship with Bridget Rooney brought the birth of his son Liam. Then came Christine Baumgartner. They married in 2004 and built a life that looked like a fairy tale. 3 more children followed. For nearly 19 years, it worked until work once again consumed the spaces where love lived. In 2023, Christine filed for divorce, and the breakup played out publicly and painfully. At 70, Kevin Costner has lost more than most people ever will. Yet he remains standing. Open Range reminded audiences who he was. Yellowstone resurrected his career. Horizon, the Western epic he had carried for decades, came his personal promise, even when critics were divided. His parents are gone. Whitney Houston is gone. His body carries the cost of decades on horseback and on set. Yet he still wakes before dawn, still walks the ranch, still writes, still dreams. His legacy is not measured in awards or box office numbers. It lives in 7 children scattered across decades, each carrying a piece of his journey. Kevin Costner once said that family is not a chapter but the whole book. He is still writing his. The boy from Linwood who packed his life into boxes finally built something he does not have to leave behind. Not the ranch, not the fortune, but the proof that a man can break, rebuild, and still stand tall when the sun goes down. His story is not a tragedy. The years after the second divorce did not bring the peace many expected, but they did bring clarity. For the first time, Kevin Costner was no longer chasing validation from Hollywood or approval from a partner who needed more than he knew how to give. He began waking earlier than ever, walking the land in silence, listening to the sounds of wind and animals instead of applause. The ranch was no longer a symbol of success. It became a place of reckoning, where nothing pretended and everything told the truth. He leaned into fatherhood with an intensity shaped by regret. The mistakes he could not undo with his older children became lessons he refused to repeat with the younger ones. Phone calls became longer. Presence became intentional. When work pulled him away, he explained why. When he returned, he listened more than he spoke. He had learned too late that love does not need grand gestures. It needs consistency. And consistency had been the one thing his life never allowed him to practice. Professionally, he stood at a crossroads. He could accept comfortable supporting roles, cash in nostalgia, and let the industry frame his final act. Or he could risk everything one last time. He chose risk, not out of ego, but out of identity. Horizon was not a business decision. It was an answer to a question he had been asking since childhood. What does a man build when he knows it may cost him everything again? The project consumed him. He wrote late into the night, rewriting scenes that reflected his own fractures. Fathers and sons. Broken promises. The price of movement. He funded it himself when studios hesitated, convinced that westerns were dead and audiences had moved on. He mortgaged property, drained savings, and bet against the very safety he had once been taught to value. Friends warned him. Advisors urged restraint. He listened politely and moved forward anyway. He had lived long enough to know that regret is heavier than failure. When Horizon premiered at Cannes Film Festival, the reception was mixed. Some critics admired the ambition. Others dismissed it as indulgent. The box office numbers did not justify the sacrifice. But Kevin did not flinch. He stood before cameras with calm eyes and said this was the film he needed to make. For the first time in years, his worth was not tied to applause. It was tied to honesty. That honesty had been hard-won. Losing his parents within a short span reopened wounds he thought time had sealed. His father's quiet strength, his mother's unspoken faith, the way they had carried loss without spectacle, all came rushing back. He found himself grieving not just their absence, but the man he had been before fame complicated everything. The son who wanted to make them proud. The boy who thought stability was something you earn by working harder. The death of Whitney Houston lingered like unfinished music. On the set of The Bodyguard, he had seen her vulnerability long before the world did. He had protected her not just on screen, but in quiet moments when doubt crept in. Speaking at her funeral forced him to confront the limits of loyalty and the helplessness that comes with watching someone you care about fight battles you cannot win. That grief deepened his understanding of loss, stripping away any illusion that strength alone could save anyone. Physically, time left its mark. The falls, the long days in the saddle, the years of carrying productions on his shoulders showed up in his joints and spine. Mornings required patience. Cold weather stiffened him. Yet movement remained his medicine. He refused to surrender to stillness. Each ache reminded him he was still here, still capable of creating, still allowed to try. What surprised him most was how the world slowly softened its judgment. Younger actors approached him not as a legend but as a craftsman. They asked about failure, about surviving the silence between successes. He told them the truth. That talent opens doors, but endurance keeps you standing. That ego burns faster than it warms. That the industry gives nothing for free and takes back more than it lends. His children became mirrors reflecting different versions of himself. In Annie's dedication to filmmaking, he saw his own early hunger. In Lily's music, he recognized the poetry he once hid in notebooks. In Hayes, working beside him on set, he glimpsed the road not taken, the life he nearly abandoned before it began. Each child carried a fragment of his story, reshaped by their own choices. He stopped answering certain questions in interviews. He no longer explained his divorces or defended his finances. He had learned that some stories are not meant to be corrected, only understood by those who live them. Instead, he spoke about process, about patience, about the importance of finishing what you start, even when the ending disappoints others. The ranch remained his anchor. Seasons changed it gently, reminding him that permanence is an illusion and continuity is earned through care. He repaired fences himself. He learned the rhythms of the land. He welcomed silence instead of filling it. The boy who once learned to let go before anything could hold him had finally found a place that did not ask him to leave as he entered his 70s. Kevin Costner no longer measured life by milestones. Birthdays were quieter. Celebrations smaller. Success was waking up with purpose and ending the day without pretending. He understood now that the search he had been on was never for fame, love, or even stability. It was for alignment between who he was and how he lived. Hollywood would remember him for epics and icons. For Dances with Wolves, for Field of Dreams, for Yellowstone. But those were chapters, not conclusions. The quieter legacy unfolded away from screens, in repaired relationships, in lessons passed down. In the decision to keep creating, even when applause faded, he no longer believed life owed him anything. That belief had freed him. The losses, the divorces, the failures, the risks that did not pay off had stripped away illusions until only truth remained. And in that truth, he found peace not in staying still, but in choosing where to stand. Kevin Costner's journey was never about perfection. It was about persistence. About a man who kept moving until movement finally brought him home. Not to a house or a marriage or a career peak, but to himself. And that at last was something he did not have to leave behind. In the quiet that followed the storms of his public life, Kevin Costner discovered something unfamiliar and unsettling: stillness without fear. For most of his years, movement had been survival. New towns, new sets, new relationships, new risks. Staying had always felt dangerous, like waiting for loss to arrive. But now, with fewer expectations placed on him by the world, he began to understand that staying was not surrender. It was courage of a different kind. He started saying no more often, not out of bitterness, but discernment. Projects that once would have tempted him with money or prestige no longer carried weight. He asked different questions now. Does this story matter to me? Will this time cost something I cannot get back? Is this work aligned with the man I am trying to be, not the one people remember? Those questions filtered his choices more effectively than any agent ever had. His relationship with time changed as well. Long days no longer felt like proof of worth. He learned to leave sets before exhaustion hollowed him out. He took meals seriously. He noticed sunsets. He allowed moments to end without trying to turn them into something permanent. For a man who had built his life chasing lasting things, learning to appreciate what was temporary became a quiet revelation. There were moments of loneliness, of course. Late at night, when the house was too quiet and the echoes of past arguments resurfaced uninvited, he would replay conversations he wished he had handled differently, silences he should have filled, absences he could never erase. Regret did not vanish with age. It matured. It became less sharp but more constant, like an ache that reminds you where you have been injured. Yet regret no longer ruled him. He understood now that shame keeps you frozen while responsibility moves you forward. He stopped punishing himself for not being perfect and focused instead on being present. When his children needed him, he showed up without excuses. When they did not, he respected their distance. Love, he had learned, is not proven by control but by trust. Creatively, his instincts sharpened. Without the pressure to please, his storytelling became more personal and less polished. He gravitated toward characters who carried quiet damage, men shaped by loss rather than bravado. These were not heroes who conquered worlds, but ones who endured them. In those characters, audiences saw echoes of the man behind them. Weathered, thoughtful, still searching but no longer desperate, the public too had changed. Fame aged differently in a world of social media and constant exposure. Kevin Costner was no longer expected to dominate headlines. That invisibility, once painful, now felt like protection. He could move through airports without entourages. He could sit in restaurants unnoticed. He could exist without performance. Occasionally younger fans approached him, not to praise his biggest hits, but to talk about scenes that had stayed with them for reasons they could not fully explain. A line spoken softly. A look held too long. A moment where nothing happened, yet everything was felt. Those encounters mattered more to him than awards ever had. They told him his work had reached people not as spectacle, but as truth. He became more open about failure, especially with young creatives. He spoke candidly about the danger of tying identity to success, about how applause can drown out intuition. He warned them that the industry will reward ambition, but rarely protect the ambitious. And he told them that if they are lucky enough to build a life outside their work, they must guard it more fiercely than any role. As the years progressed, Kevin Costner stopped framing his story as one of loss. He began to see it as one of education. Every broken marriage had taught him something about himself he had refused to learn earlier. Every financial risk had clarified what mattered and what did not. Every fall from favor had stripped away ego until only craft remained. He did not romanticize pain, but he respected it. Pain had been his most honest teacher. It had revealed his limits, his blind spots, his need for connection. It had humbled him in ways success never could. And humility, he discovered, made space for gratitude. Gratitude for mornings when nothing demanded him. Gratitude for children who still called. Gratitude for stories left to tell. Gratitude for a body that, despite its protests, still carried him forward.